beyond the thunder and lightning, past the clouds, over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Greetings. Welcome back as always. Thank you all so much for joining us today. You know, the New York Times reports in major breakthrough, UN Security Council adopts U.S. peace plan for Gaza. Russia and China abstained in the vote, which provides a so-called legal mandate for the Trump administration's vision of how to move past the ceasefire to rebuild the war-ravaged enclave after 2 years of war. U.S. peace plan? Really? Well, who wrote it and whose interests are being protected? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each episode, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events and the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. Let's quickly look at a couple of today's headlines. Trump faces a splintering GOP and rare dissent from his party. The House of Representatives today will vote to release additional investigation files related to the deceased sexual predator Jeffrey Epstein. The president finds himself in a much weakened position. Polls show his lowest approval ratings since returning to office. Some in his base are calling for more to be done to ease a continued affordability crisis. And now House Republicans have dared to buck his directives on an issue that advisors say has exasperated him, the Epstein issue. A weakened position, lowest approval rating? True. According to The Economist, 302 days into Trump's term, the president's net approval rating is negative 18%, down 0.2 of a point since last week, down 18 points, down 18%, 0.2 of a point since last week, 39% approve, 57% disapprove, 4% not sure. So that begs the question, why did Senate Democrats fold last week on the ACA subsidy issue? They've got a weakened opponent and they collapsed in the middle of the fight. More has to be done regarding affordability. True. Lowering prices is another unkept campaign promise. A vote is scheduled today on the Epstein issue. Trump has taken a 180-degree turn on this one. Why? I believe because someone in his administration finally read the proposed bill and came to the realization that the Department of Justice is under no obligation to really release anything that it doesn't want to release. There are too many outs for them. All they have to do is say, ongoing investigation, we can't release the files, we got to keep these things in-house. Once again, don't fall for the banana in the tailpipe trick. Antiwar.com reports Trump won't rule out sending U.S. troops to Venezuela. The president has been sending mixed signals on the possibility of war with Venezuela. And this is Dave DeCamp reporting from antiwar.com. He said yesterday that he won't rule out sending American troops into Venezuela amid the U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean and push toward a potential war to oust President Nicolas Maduro. Quote, I don't rule that out. I don't rule out anything, end quote. He said this in the Oval Office when asked if he would put boots on the ground. Why? War for more oil? Is a socialist democracy really that big of a threat to the empire? Oh, by the way, what's the difference between sending troops into Venezuela and the decision to send troops into Vietnam? Haven't we seen this movie before? And doesn't it always end the same? The sequel to Vietnam was Afghanistan. The Financial Times reports Lawrence Summers to step back from public roles over ties to Epstein. The former U.S. Treasury Secretary sought pedophiles' advice over relationship he was pursuing. Summers, who ran Bill Clinton's Treasury Department and was later the president of Harvard, sent repeated messages to Epstein about a woman codenamed Peril in 2018 and 2019, according to files released from Epstein's estate. Question: why would one seek relationship advice from a pedophile unless one is of like mind? Your Honor, if I may pose a follow-up question, Webster defines peril as exposure to the risk of being injured, destroyed, or lost. You know what? In anticipation of an objection from the defense as leading, I withdraw the question. On today's episode, the issue before us is the New York Times reports the United Nations Security Council yesterday approved President Trump's peace plan for Gaza, a breakthrough that provides a so-called legal UN mandate for the administration's vision of how to move past the ceasefire and rebuild the war-ravaged Gaza Strip after 2 years of war. My guest is an American historian who holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is truly one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. He's a phenomenally, really good person and a man who I am very proud to call a friend. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before we get to the so-called peace plan, one side note. As I'm sure you're aware, PBS is airing a 13-part documentary about the American Revolution. I've watched the first 2 parts, and as they discuss what led up to the war, they discuss the whole idea of taxation without representation. They hardly mention, if at all, the Somerset case and the fear of the colonists that as a result of the Somerset case, the colonies could lose access to their free enslaved African labor. You are the author of numerous books, one entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. Is the omission of a serious discussion about the Somerset case a serious omission in your mind?
Well, clearly it is. I mean, it's not only the Somerset case and the fear of creeping abolitionism, which would have jeopardized the fortunes of the so-called founding fathers, grounded overwhelmingly in enslavement of Africans. It's also the question of indigenous dispossession. Mm-hmm. That is to say that in 1762, 1763, London had drawn the so-called proclamation line. That is to say, London was leery and wary of continuing to expend blood and treasure, ousting the Native Americans from their land so that George Washington and other predators could seize that land. I happened to look at George Washington's will for the aforementioned book you noted, The Capital of Slavery. And upon his death, he was one of the biggest landowners on planet Earth, most of the land previously belonging to the indigenous population.
I think he was considered the wealthiest man in the country at that time.
Most likely that is true. But what I find particularly troubling and disturbing is not only the insult to the indigenous population and the African population, that is to say, this great leap forward for humanity, so-called. Ken Burns, the chief filmmaker, said it was the most important event since the birth of Jesus Christ some 2,000 years ago, which in many ways is a backhanded slap to those who forged the religion we now know as Islam. But it's also the reality that this kind of history does a disservice in terms of helping us to understand the present. I had thought that one of the purposes of history, one of the purposes of studying the past, was so that we could better understand the present.
Mm-hmm.
But this series does not point in that direction. I mean, what is the connection between 1776 and the rise of Trumpism? It's a kind of incoherence. What is the connection between 1776 and the rise of President Andrew Jackson, a slave owner, a slave trader, a man who forced Native Americans out of the southeast quadrant of North America on the Trail of Tears to supposedly their last homeland in what is now Oklahoma, once called Indian Territory. And so in some ways, it's a boondoggle that government tax dollars were funneled to Ken Burns and his cronies so that they could produce this spectacle. I expect protests to emerge about this series.
To that point, what you're just talking about the Trail of Tears, the vestiges of racism in America. Is there a correlation between the manner in which Native American land or Native Americans were dispossessed of their land and what transpired with African Americans through the 40s, 50s, and the 60s? Just as another point. I will also say, for me, one of the most serious glaring omissions of this piece is the fact that Dr. Gerald Horne is not featured in it. That's just my own personal assessment. You don't have to say a word unless you want to. But I look at all the historians that are listed. I don't see you. I don't find it credible.
Well, there would have been a larger protest if my voice had been included. So I wholly and fully understand that.
Oh, I do too. But one must still highlight omissions when they are found.
But I also pointed out something else in a letter that I doubt will be published in a popular magazine. I responded to one of their reviews of the series. With regard to the point about history helping to guide us in the present, I pointed out that it's remarkable that the community that voted most heavily against Mr. Trump, speaking of Black Americans, was also the community that sided disproportionately with the Redcoats in seeking to foil the effort by the enslavers to set up a slaveholders' republic. And then they duplicated and replicated that again in round two in the War of 1812, where they participated in the sacking and plundering of the White House and then fled on British boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. And so this is a kind of court history. It's a kind of history for the ruling elite and for liberal know-nothings, but certainly it does not contribute to a fuller and complex and complete understanding of how we reached this perilous point of Trumpism.
Now to the perilous point of Trumpism, this so-called peace plan in occupied Palestine. The New York Times reports the council's vote was also a major diplomatic victory for the Trump administration. For the past 2 years, as the conflict between Israel and Hamas has raged, the United States had been isolated at the United Nations over its staunch support for Israel. There's an awful lot packed into that paragraph. I think an awful lot of propaganda packed into that paragraph. Your thoughts on what does all of this tell us, Dr. Horne?
Well, I think some in our audience might be surprised that there was not a veto by China or Russia. But as I sift through the tea leaves, what I find striking is that a number of leading Muslim and or Arab states were actually on the side of Mr. Trump. You see this reflected, I'm afraid to say, in the visit to the White House as we speak, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. We see this with regard to Turkey, for example, which despite fire-breathing rhetoric has a rather significant relationship with Israel. But despite the fact that Russia did not go forward with its alternative plan, and I assume that they did not go forward precisely because of what I just mentioned, the opposition from the Trump crony states in that part of the world, it still begs the question of who will disarm Hamas when they have said that they will not be disarmed. Who will comprise the so-called stabilization force, that is to say, what might be called peacekeeping forces, who will be dispatched to Gaza? What happens if the stabilization force comes into armed conflict with Hamas? And as things stand now, that is almost inevitable. And how would the populations on the street in Istanbul, in Amman, Jordan, in particular, how will they respond when these so-called stabilization forces are doing the dirty work of Israel and U.S. imperialism? Not only that, but this so-called Board of Peace and so-called peace plan, it begs the question of what is going to be the response from European nations, which have been on a steady path to recognition of Palestinian statehood, pointing in particular to the initiative by France and Saudi Arabia jointly, which has taken place in recent months. Not only that, but the diplomatic support for Palestinian statehood from Spain and Ireland, even the UK to a certain degree. So I will not say that this peace plan is dead on arrival, but certainly it's headed for the hospice.
Well, you mentioned Mohammed bin Salman, also known as Mohammed Bonesaw, getting an audience at the White House, and that follows last week's audience with al-Jilani, the head chopper in chief in Syria. So I just wanted to make that point that there are a lot of blood is being tracked through on the carpet at the White House, and I don't know if they'll be able to get those stains out.
Well, it also reveals and exposes the hypocrisy of the Trump regime. Recall that it was not so long ago that Mr. Trump was threatening to send U.S. forces into Nigeria with guns a-blazing, to use his colorful phrase, supposedly because of a Christian genocide in that part of Africa. And yet he rolls out the red carpet. And I don't mean bloodstained carpet, although I understand if your audience interprets it that way. He rolls out the red carpet for, as you put it, the head chopper in chief, a former commander of Al-Qaeda. And as we speak, Al-Qaeda is engaged in a blockade of Bamako, the capital of Mali, which is in an alliance with the Sahel states, including Mr. Traore's Burkina Faso, not to mention Niger. And one wonders if Mr. Trump is so gung-ho about religious zealotry, particularly religious zealotry that cuts against the interests of the Christian population. Why is he embracing Al-Qaeda? But I think, on the other hand, these two stories that you have broached exposes a possible significant and profound flaw within MAGA, the Make America Great Again coalition. We should take very seriously this so-called MAGA civil war ignited by former Fox News host Tucker Carlson, entertaining and throwing softball questions at Nick Fuentes of the Hitler's Cool faction of the Republican Party. This has exposed a deepening cleavage between the pro-Zionist MAGA forces and the Hitler's cool MAGA factions. It does not take an oracle or a seer to suggest that this was a cleavage that was waiting to be exposed. And it's unclear how Mr. Trump will undo the damage. Now, thus far, he has refused to denounce Tucker Carlson, although in the past, Tucker Carlson has been quite critical of Mr. Trump. But the defections from the right wing continue to persist, the latest being Robert George, a conservative Princeton professor who resigned from the Heritage Foundation, the primary think tank for MAGA. For example, you recall Project 2025, for example. And he resigned precisely because Kevin Roberts, who is the titular leader of the Heritage Foundation, released a video basically justifying Tucker Carlson's interview. And then when queried about it, say, I don't really follow the news. I don't know who Nick Fuentes is, which in some ways exposes him for the craven hypocrite that he appears to be. I don't see this deepening rift going away anytime soon. And hopefully it'll lead to the demise, ultimately, of the MAGA formation.
Getting back to this so-called peace plan, Dave DeCamp has a piece in antiwar.com where he's really asking who wrote, Trump, of course, is being credited with writing the peace plan. Trump also is being credited with inventing fire, rain, and I think wind, and discovering the wheel. But Dave DeCamp is really making the point, or looking at whose interests are truly being addressed here with this so-called peace plan, and calling it a peace plan takes me to Gil Scott-Heron telling us that peace is not the absence of war, it is the absence of the need for war. And I don't really see how this 20-point so-called peace plan, which is really no more than capitulation and surrender, calling for capitulation and surrender by the Palestinians, doesn't do away, in their minds, with the need for war.
Not only that, but there could really be a significant backfire if this plan is pursued, particularly in Jordan, which to a certain degree has been a satrap for Israeli forces, despite the fact that a disproportionate percentage of Jordanian population is actually a Palestinian. This will not be embraced on the streets of Amman, that is to say, the capital, and this peace plan will be rejected by the population. It could threaten the monarchy there, which has been skating on thin ice for some years, if not decades. And one can go around the region and come to a similar conclusion. I was struck by an article in today's Wall Street Journal by Karen Elliott House, who has written extensively on the Saudi regime. And she has suggested that the Saudis will be wary about embracing this peace plan, not least because they are leery of how their populace will view this plan if Riyadh decides to affix its signature to it. And this is striking because usually when we read about Saudi Arabia, we do not necessarily hear stories about popular discontent or potential popular discontent. But I think what it bespeaks is the unpopularity of the so-called peace plan, how it could backfire, how it could ultimately weaken the pro-Yankee regimes in the region, and how another aspect of that process could be deepening the internal rift within MAGA, because part of the rift within MAGA, and you can see this in the rhetoric of the Black woman flamethrower Candace Owens, is that the United States has gone overboard in terms of the support of Israel. And whatever happened to so-called America First, for example. And if you have the weakening, if not the dislodging, of pro-US regimes as a result of this pro-Israel Gaza peace plan, so-called, it will help to confirm in the minds of many in the GOP that Mr. Trump has gone overboard, has gone too far in terms of trying to appease the Zionist faction of his coalition.
As you mentioned, the Saudis possibly throwing a wrench into this plan as it relates to how the Saudi population will react to it. As I understand it, one of the motivations or reasons why October 7th became October 7th was that Yahya Sinwar, at the time the head of Hamas, saw that the Saudis were getting ready to enter into an agreement with Israel. And Yahya Sinwar understood that if that agreement had been solidified, that the support for Hamas would have vanished or become incredibly diminished in the minds of the Saudis.
Well, it's not only Hamas. Saudi Arabia has a very burning problem in its so-called backyard. I'm speaking of Yemen. Recall that it was not so long ago that there was fierce combat between Saudi forces and Yemeni forces. The Saudi forces did not acquit themselves well, which is understandable, not only because of the fierceness of their opponents, speaking of the Yemenis, but also because what is the incentive for Saudi forces to lay down their lives so that MBS can buy another yacht, for example? And so it would not surprise me at all if in the aftermath of this so-called peace plan that the forces that are popularly referred to as the Houthis, al-Ansar, would reignite this conflict with Saudi Arabia to the detriment of the kingdom. Recall that you mentioned October 7, 2023, the onset of the escalation in this decades-long conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, when on October 19th is when the Yemeni forces entered the fray, basically establishing a kind of blockade over certain Israeli ports, establishing a blockade in terms of ships traversing the Red Sea to reach Israel, shooting missiles into Israel itself. They have said that there is a cessation of hostilities in light of what has transpired in recent days and weeks, but do not be surprised if there is an escalation of hostilities. And once again, it would help to expose the frailties and the weaknesses and the negativity of this so-called peace plan.
And you just mentioned, you were talking about Jordan and the fact that a number of Jordanians are actually Palestinian. King Abdullah II, his wife, is Palestinian, just to provide a data point to support the point that you made about Jordanians and their close relationship to Palestine. Final point on this whole discussion, and that is that Professor Jeffrey Sachs writes that the Trump administration is pushing an Israeli-crafted resolution, or has pushed down because it got approved, an Israeli-crafted resolution saying at the UN, saying that it does three things. It establishes U.S. political control over Gaza, separates Gaza from the rest of Palestine, and allows the U.S. and therefore Israel to determine the timeline for the withdrawal from Gaza. Dr. Sachs says that this is imperialism masquerading as a peace process. Your thoughts?
Well, he's obviously on point. He's obviously on the money. And I must reiterate that this will have severe domestic consequences for the internal workings of the MAGA coalition. because what Jeffrey Sachs is saying helps to reaffirm the notion pushed by Candace Owens and others that America first has morphed somehow into Israel first, and that Mr. Trump is unduly close to Netanyahu, and in fact has interfered in Israeli internal affairs by suggesting that the prosecution of Mr. Netanyahu for corruption should not go forward. What gives Mr. Trump the right to tell the Israeli authorities how they should deal with their corruption-stained prime minister? And so if Israel is lurching towards being a kind of 51st state of the United States of America, this embodies significant peril, not only for the MAGA coalition and its internal cleavages and rifts, but also what it basically means is that the United States is importing into the United States all of the adversaries of Israel. That is to say, if you are truly concerned about Palestinian statehood, and if you recognize that a major stumbling block to Palestinian statehood is the billion upon billion upon billion of dollars that the United States sends across the Atlantic and across the Mediterranean into Israel, well, then why not confront the United States directly, in addition to confronting Israel directly? And this is the downside of this all too close relationship, all too close alliance with Israeli expansionism that has not been explored sufficiently in the mainstream media.
I want to shift regions of the world here, but I think that there are ties between the two, and that is the Latin Times reports. And folks know I'm not using the Latin Times as a credible source because I don't think that it is, but I just find this headline to be incredibly intriguing. Trump officials reportedly consider exiling Maduro and top Venezuelan regime officials in Turkey or Russia. Trump administration officials, obviously unnamed, are reportedly considering exiling President Maduro and other officials to Turkey and Russia and Cuba, saying that they might want to start learning how to speak Turkish or speak Russian. This would be laughable, and many would say improbable. But I don't really, well, that of course is part of the calculus, but the signal that a headline of this nature is sending, your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, I've already imagined a face-to-face meeting between Mr. Trump and Mr. Maduro, which of course Mr. Trump has brooded. And I can imagine Mr. Trump.
You said that Mr. Trump has
brooded, has raised.
Got it. Okay, yeah.
And I can imagine Mr. Trump putting on the table this really insane idea of exiling Mr. Maduro across the Atlantic. And Mr. Maduro says, okay, well, let's talk about exiling you to Japan, for example. Mm-hmm. And if you decide to move your shop to Tokyo, I will consider, for example, moving my shop to Moscow or Ankara. I think that once again, Mr. Trump is playing with fire because he's not only alienating Caracas and its many allies in the hemisphere. Speaking of Colombia, not least, of course, he's imposed sanctions against President Petro of Colombia. But there are still armed factions within Colombia who I'm sure would be enthusiastic about joining their Venezuelan comrades if Mr. Trump was so audacious as to send military forces into Venezuela, not to mention the fact that it's more than a notion to talk about subduing Venezuela, which is larger than Ukraine, larger than Texas, population of 30 million, millions enrolled in militia, mountainous terrain, in the interior in particular, not to mention the fact that of late, Venezuela has received significant support from Russia, not to mention significant support from China, not to mention the fact that as you sift through the tea leaves hemispherically, Mr. Trump should be paying close attention to the recent vote in Ecuador, where the voters turned thumbs down on the idea of foreign military bases, presumably U.S. military bases, being established in that neighbor of Venezuela. Not to mention the vote this past Sunday in Chile, where a communist received more votes than a Trumpista candidate, although with a runoff, that particular result may be reversed. But what it should tell you is that after decades of anti-communist propaganda, after the United States helping to impose the Pinochet dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship in Chile, post-1973 with the overthrow of socialist Salvador Allende, that the thirst of the Chilean masses and Chilean working class for more radical transformation has not ebbed one iota, one scintilla. But I do not expect Mr. Trump necessarily to be following the news, although it is remarkable, is it not, that after his own fire-breathing rhetoric directed at Brazil, he's had to back down. One of the many retreats that Mr. Trump has made, not least, as you noted, on the Epstein case. That is to say, he's eased tariffs on Brazilian coffee because of this affordability crisis, for example. After insulting Mr. Lula da Silva, the leader, because of his regime going after Mr. Bolsonaro, his predecessor, who tried a la Trump to execute a coup d'etat and prevent Mr. Lula da Silva from coming to power. Now Mr. Trump speaks warmly of Lula da Silva. And many of Mr. Trump's base in the agricultural community are still smarting over the fact that not only did Mr. Trump and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent execute this multi-billion-dollar bailout of Argentina, and the payoff for the Argentines was significant. They immediately began to snatch from U.S. Midwestern farmers the soybean market in China. And that has not gone down very well in the Midwest. And in fact, you can expect a number of Midwestern farmers to be going belly up, bankrupt sooner rather than later. And so Mr. Trump obviously has not paid attention not only to the title, but the substance of this program. He has not been connecting the dots. And perhaps if he would watch Wilmer Leon on a regular basis, he would not be in the pickle that he now finds himself.
Well, if you watch the show, especially when Dr. Gerald Horne is the featured guest, he could learn a thing or two. You mentioned China and Russia supporting Venezuela. President Putin in Russia has been very, very outspoken in, photographs of Putin and Maduro shaking hands as missile defense systems and other weaponry have been sent into Venezuela. And President Putin has been very clear saying, we're going to back you as need be if called upon to do so. China has been seeming to be more reserved in their public support, but we know that China has invested billions of dollars into Venezuela. They're not going to sit idly by and allow those investments to be squandered by the United States. So I'm seeing China's response to this would be more economic than military, as Russia's would be more military than economic. Your thoughts?
Well, I think there's something to that, but Mr. Trump probably feels he has an ace of diamonds in his back pocket, because in recent days, there's been alarming uptick in inflamed rhetoric between Tokyo and Beijing. Mr. Trump, after his visit to that part of the world, might feel that he can somehow instigate a conflict between the number 2 economy, speaking of China, and the number 4 or 5 economy, speaking of Japan, which would, of course, be quite in the interests of U.S. imperialism. Because we need to recognize, as we try to do with this global analysis and figure out the next moves and steps of U.S. imperialism, that a turning point was possibly reached with that meeting between President Xi and President Trump in South Korea in the last few weeks. Because when Mr. Xi Jinping, the leader of China, signaled that they will supposedly start accepting soybean contracts from Midwestern farmers, although we're still waiting to see if that's going to be confirmed. He also put the United States on a kind of probation with regard to export of rare earth minerals to the United States of America, which are necessary for smartphones and fighter jets and automobiles and all the rest.
And cruise missiles. And so what that signal is that China has a kind of upper hand with regard to this confrontation with U.S. imperialism. And this is something the U.S. imperialism is not accustomed to, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was interpreted wrongly and falsely, in my opinion, as signaling the onset of the reign of the so-called sole remaining superpower, which supposedly had a superior system, speaking of capitalism. But here we are in the year 2025, and that kind of deranged thinking is being questioned from multiple sides, not least from Beijing. This may be somewhat of a rhetorical question, or all of a rhetorical question. Can the U.S. fight on 2 fronts? Can the U.S. fight in Ukraine? Actually 3 fronts. Can the U.S. fight in Ukraine, Venezuela, and then possibly Iran?
Dubious at best, particularly when you see that this massive ship, the Gerald Horne, has been taken out of the Mediterranean in the backyard of Iran and shipped to Caracas, for example, or shipped to the outskirts of Venezuela, I should say more accurately. But it's also because that particular movement also moved the Gerald Horne from the backyard of the European theater. And part of the leverage that Mr. Trump has with the European Union is this conflict in Ukraine. In fact, there's an interesting article in the Financial Times of London this morning. The title, the theme of the article is "The New Scramble for Europe." Although in the 19th century, there was a so-called scramble for Africa, with the European powers carving up that continent like it's a Thanksgiving turkey. Well, now, because of the weakness of the European Union, its dependence upon U.S. imperialism, particularly with regard to the Ukraine crisis, with Mr. Trump continually doing 180s, pledging to crack down on Russia and then retreating and backtracking. The fact that in the Western Balkans was supposedly on track for EU membership, there is considerable influence not only from Russia and Turkey, but also from China, for example. And so U.S. imperialism is engaged in what the Yale historian Paul Kennedy has called imperial overstretch. That is to say that it has too many demands on its resources and not enough resources to meet the moment, particularly when you have these elections in the United States in the past few days, where the GOP, Mr. Trump's party, suffered really significant and profound losses. The affordability crisis is not going away anytime soon. And Mr. Trump's usual gambit of starting fires and then posing as a firefighter when he puts out the fire, that is to say, imposing tariffs to exacerbate the affordability crisis, particularly with regard to food items,
Mhm.
and then appearing majestically to remove those tariffs as if he's accomplished something magnificent when actually all he's done is put out a fire that he started. So Mr. Trump is in way over his head, and it would be ironic, if not significant, that a significant blow to U.S. imperialism would take place in this hemisphere, particularly when one considers the so-called moth-eaten Monroe Doctrine, dubbed by the New York Post, Mr. Trump's favorite newspaper, as the Dunroe Doctrine. That is to say, keeping Russia and China out of this hemisphere. Obviously, that has backfired in Venezuela. If he were to be so audacious as to engage in a military confrontation with Caracas, he would not be able to extinguish the fires. This would not be an occasion where Mr. Trump could start a fire and then appear to put out the flames that he ignited.
You mentioned the Gerald Ford, and folks need to understand that it's not just the Gerald Ford, it's the 21 or 23 ships, battleships that are part of the fleet that support the Ford. So there's the point being, there's a tremendous amount of naval horsepower just beyond the Ford, the whole battle group just beyond the Ford that has now found its way to the Caribbean. Not to mention how much it costs, how many millions a day it costs to support that thing. And I was reading in the South China Morning Post, I think it was yesterday, it might have been this morning, that now that China has launched its latest carrier, the Fujian, in reading that piece about the Fujian, it seems as though you're looking at the Fujian as an from a technological perspective, you're looking at the Fujian as the now technologically superior ship to the Gerald Ford, which has now become a rowboat.
Well, it's not only that, but it also may be a floating casket. And
no question.
I regret having to say that, given the fact that you have young men and women aboard that ship of fools. But given
hypersonic missiles,
exactly, given the way that Russia has armed their Venezuelan comrades, it's not beyond imagination to see the Gerald Ford sinking into the lapping waves of the Caribbean. And speaking of which, I should also add another point with regard to the domestic situation here in the United States of America. Not only have you had the election of a social democrat, Z. Kwame Mamdani, in Gotham, but in Seattle, on the other side of the continent, you've also had the election of a social democrat as mayor. And of course, that result has been derided in the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is predictable. I'm waiting for them to find out that in Ithaca, New York, the college town in upstate New York, that a communist was elected to the city council, which might be auguring similar events elsewhere. Recall that it was the election of a communist, Ben Davis Jr., a black man with roots in Atlanta, but elected to New York City Council from Harlem in the 1940s, supplanting Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who then moved on to Congress in Washington. That in some ways, when Davis was elected to the New York City Council, that ignited an allergic reaction on nearby Wall Street. He was unceremoniously, if not illicitly, ejected from that body, was then jailed, and along with his comrades, including Paul Robeson, who had been a major donor to Davis Jr.'s campaign, you saw an immense backlash against the growth of the left, which I'm afraid to say was backed by many liberal forces, including the American Civil Liberties Union, and of course, quite shamefully, the NAACP, which was particularly harsh in terms of the vendetta it conducted against Robeson. So that was 75 odd years ago. And now in 2025, we see, as in Chile, that those forces have not been extinguished. In some ways, I see it as a direct counter-reaction to this $1 trillion paycheck directed to the grubby little paws of Elon Musk, a paycheck that's larger than the economy of countless and numerous nations, not least in this hemisphere. And so it was only a matter of time before that glaring contradiction, $1 trillion going to one man, while food stamp benefits are being suspended, while healthcare premiums are raised through the roof. That is an unsustainable proposition, and Mr. Trump is going to have his hands full trying to deal with that particular crisis.
When we look at the focus on Venezuela, and you understand that Maduro comes out of the Chavista revolution. Petro led the M19 forces in Colombia. Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua led the Sandinistas. These aren't people like Trump who just stumbled into a presidency. These are guys that led revolutions, successfully led revolutions in their countries. Makes me think about Zimbabwe and former President Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Came out of the bush. Unlike Zelensky, they're not wearing fatigues because it's fashionable. They were wearing fatigues because they were about that life. So when Petro says, I'm backing Maduro, when Ortega says, I'm backing Maduro, there's a mindset, in my humble opinion, there's a different mindset here. You're talking about revolutionaries. You're not talking about politicians, which means they're going to bring a whole different way of playing cards to the poker game. Your thoughts?
Well, it's not only that, but I'm glad you referenced Southern Africa, because Mr. Trump will be boycotting the G20 meeting unfolding shortly at the southern tip of the continent in South Africa. It's another insult, another slap in the face of the African National Congress government, which of course has been pilloried by the Trump regime, supposedly because of carrying out a so-called white genocide against the Afrikaner population, who still command the heights of the South African economy. Immigration has been cut back in the United States, except for Europeans seeking to enter this country from South Africa. And to show you how Mr. Trump is serving as a kind of accelerant for forging anti-Trump coalitions, pay attention to the Hague Group, chaired by South Africa and Colombia, which is pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli expansionism. Recall that Colombia has been as full-throated as the ANC government with regard to charging genocide being inflicted on Gaza. We fully expect the Hague Group to increase in size, particularly in light of the Security Council giving its imprimatur to this so-called Trump peace plan and the so-called board of peace that Trump has come up with. And so once again, I think that Mr. Trump is increasingly becoming a victim of circumstance. It seemed when he was inaugurated in January 2025 that he was commanding events, but increasingly on the home front, and notably and particularly and especially on the international front, events are overwhelming and overcoming him, which of course is more good news for progressive forces in the United States of America.
That just reminds me when I was at Christian Brothers High School in Sacramento, Brother George Bertola and Brother Chris used to say, "Sir, you've become a victim of your own event. You have a problem of your own making." And I just want to also let the audience know I wasn't dismissing Mr. Goita in Mali. I wasn't dismissing Chirare in Burkina Faso when I was talking about folks coming out of the bush. I was just looking at the closest confrontations on the calendar. That's why I mentioned Ortega and Petro. I wasn't, but because there's a whole cadre. I mean, if we connect these dots with, again, Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger, and then look at what's happening in Colombia and Venezuela, there's a whole cadre of revolutionaries that have now come to the forefront. And this is not your father's revolution. These guys are there to stay.
Well, that's why we have to pay close attention to the maneuvers of Mr. Trump. We mentioned, for example, the embrace of Mr. Al-Jilani, Mr. Al-Shara in the Oval Office. I see that as an attempt to forge a coalition with religious zealots who, as we speak, as noted, are seeking to strangle and asphyxiate Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. We see that as well in the embrace, as we speak, of MBS, Mohammed Bonesaw, as you put it, in the Oval Office. Recall that on September 11th, 2001, 15 of the 19 hijackers who were said to have attacked New York and Washington were of Saudi extraction. Mysteriously, a number of Saudis who supposedly had connection to that plot were allowed to leave the United States. And instead of exacting bloody vengeance against the Saudis, instead, vengeance was exacted against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which was obviously not only a kind of misdirection, but may have been the most boneheaded, catastrophic maneuver in the inglorious history of U.S. imperialism. And so it would be premature, once again, to uncork the champagne bottles with regard to our attempt to celebrate the ultimate and approaching demise of Trumpism. But it's not premature to begin to analyze the post-Trump era, which is rapidly appearing before us as we speak.
And that takes us back to where we began, and we'll wrap up here. I made mention of the fact that when you look at Trump's poll numbers, he's losing ground just exponentially. His numbers are in the toilet. And it's also important to remember in this that the Democrats' numbers are bad as well. But just quickly, your thoughts on those 7 Democrats and 1 independent that folded when they snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, because they were looking, the numbers were still in their favor. They were entering the 3rd pay period of furloughed federal employees without paychecks. They were looking at Thanksgiving on the horizon, and most importantly, Black Friday. And we know, with the economy being in the circumstance that it is, the one thing the Trump administration didn't want to do was go into Black Friday and folks not having paychecks. And they folded. One can only wonder if you had Schumer playing good cop, bad cop, and that he really didn't want this thing to succeed in the first place. Dr. Horne.
Well, Mr. Schumer, to his everlasting shame, did not endorse Mr. Mamdani in his race to claim City Hall. That's one of the reasons why increasingly people are beginning to refer to him as Senator Chucklehead Schumer. And I think you can draw a straight line between the weaknesses and failures of the Schumer leadership and the rise of Mr. Mamdani in Gotham, the rise of a social democratic mayor in Seattle. That is to say that increasingly, I think there are going to be ever stiffer challenges to the leadership of the Democratic Party internally, and that probably will include a primary challenge to Chuck Schumer because he's vulnerable. Of course, AOC is the most likely candidate, but there are others as well. And so I think that on this 18th day of November in 2025, there is quite a bit to ponder, some of which is negative, but increasingly there are positive signs that should be uplifting.
Positive signs as in a shift to the left. I assume that a progressive shift, which, and to connect the dots and complete the thought, that because folks may wonder, Wilmer, what are you saying is the connection between the folding on the Affordable Care Act, the fact that that was going to give momentum to the very progressive wing of the party, and the elite part of the party do not want to validate or want to tread very lightly down that path. Is that
not only that, but just like we've alluded to this internal civil war in the MAGA base, over the question of Zionism, you have something similar with regard to the Democratic Party.
That's the point. Yes,
Schumer is one of the most stalwart, staunchest supporters of Israel.
He's the Zionist.
Exactly. And so that's increasingly becoming unsustainable. Mr. Mamdani showed that you don't necessarily have to be in the pocket of Netanyahu in order to prevail in an election in New York City, at least. I trust and I hope that Mr. Schumer, or Chucklehead, as he's increasingly being called.
Senator Chucklehead, you must give him his respect.
Sorry, I apologize. Senator Chucklehead, I assume is paying attention to the news.
And as we get out, if we keep this in New York, Richie Torres in the pocket of AIPAC, Gregory Meeks in the pocket of AIPAC, what's his name, the minority leader, Hakeem Jeffries in the pocket of AIPAC. You, as Gil Scott-Heron would say, the endless list that won't be missed when at last America is purged. Dr. Gerald Horne, Capital of Slavery is the latest book. Let's see if we can get that up there one more time there we go. The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. Phenomenal read. And let me suggest, folks, as we are spiraling closer to the holiday season, give the gift of insight, give the gift of wisdom, give the gift of research. That's not a bad thing to provide right there. The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. Dr. Gerald Horne, thank you. Greatly appreciated. As always, thank you for your flexibility this morning, and look forward to having you back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Enjoy the day. Folks, again, I want to thank Dr. Horne for joining me today. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. Still, we know who the guest is going to be, but just haven't locked him in yet. So don't want to put anybody out on blast. But trust me, in the words of the Moon Man, it's going to be a big one. Please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show. I will say this, Ms. Carol Asbaram, I hope, I believe, I trust your wish will be granted on tomorrow's show. Follow us on social media. All the links are below in the show description. This is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Remember, talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, have a blessed remainder of your day. I'm Dr. Wilmer Leon. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.